Welcome back to our series about exploring the meaning of Christian identity by exploring the sojourning history of Israel. In the last section, we looked at the family dynamics of Jacob's family as well as their relationship with their Canaanite neighbors. In this section, we will look deeper into the story of Joseph and how he learned what it meant to be called as God's chosen. With Joseph's marginality within his family being established in the previous section, we see that he lives an increasingly marginalized life in Egypt, which also becomes a liminal space as he is nevertheless freed to express his creativity without the hindrance of his brothers. Although he was a slave, we are told that God alongside and with Joseph used these experiences for good. Similarly to other immigrants, Joseph did not see his marginality as something to be defeated by, but sought to overcome it by proving himself, which we can read in Genesis 39:2-6. Indeed, in Genesis 39:2, we can read that the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. Reflecting on his own experience as an immigrant, Junyoung Lee composed the parable of the dandelion, writing, "The dandelion worked harder and longer than any others, because it had to prove itself in the new place. By the time the other plants and grasses had started to come up from the ground, the dandelion already stood up from the others. When they sprouted leaves, the dandelion had already sprouted a bright, golden, round flower, resembling the rising sun. The dandelion was so proud of its flower, the only flower in the whole yard. The dandelion did it to brighten up the yard and please its owner." In this, Lee speaks about how Asian Americans, the yellow dandelion, come into this country with an optimism that believes in hard work and the American dream, that if they just work hard enough, then they will earn acceptance and a home in American society. So perhaps Joseph thought the same way, that by working hard he can earn the respect of his master and a better place in the household. It was, after all, possible to earn one's freedom through good service at that time. However, the moment he displeased his master's wife, he went back into being a foreign Habiru, losing any approval he might have once enjoyed, as she accused him, saying, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice." This again echoes Lee's experience, who writes, "The dandelion thought that the owner of the house would be pleased with its flower. But again, the owner came out and pulled it out. This time he said, 'I hate to see this yellow color in my green yard.' When the dandelion heard that, it finally realized that the reason the owner hated it was because of its yellow color. The dandelion therefore decided not to display its yellowness." Now, no matter how hard Asian Americans work to earn approval and acceptance of white Americans, it is perceived, through Lee's example, that Asian Americans are still seen as perpetual foreigners due to color and phenotype, which openly shows itself especially during national distress, like with the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, or the rise of anti-Asian racism in the wake of the COVID-19 outbreak. Another scholar, Sang-Hyun Lee, concurs, writing, "The racism barrier keeps Asian Americans from achieving what sociologists call structural assimilation. Most Asian immigrants have no problem in the area of cultural assimilation, the adoption of many of white America's cultural values and mores, and the attainment of sufficient linguistic and social skills to function in white American society. Those Asian Americans who are born here, of course, have all of the cultural traits of their white American peers. But structural assimilation is quite another matter. This kind of assimilation means Asian Americans becoming truly one of us in white American society and having the same privileges and life chances as white people. This, of course, is also true of all immigrant groups of color, in that we are seen as foreign first and American second at first glance. Our Americanness is not something that we can take for granted, which is why many of us feel a desire to be more American than the Americans, which is demonstrated by many immigrant groups of color voting Republican and distancing themselves from more recent and particularly undocumented arrivals in an effort to distance themselves from them. In other words, many immigrant groups of color and many native-born people of color don't want to be associated with the negative stereotypes that affect people of color. And so they try to distance themselves from those stereotypes by acting as quote unquote white American as they possibly can, so as to gain acceptance from that dominant culture. So, what does this have to do with Joseph? Well, it shows that despite um, his hard work, despite his ability to prove himself to his master, as soon as something goes wrong, he is seen as being a Habiru again, and is subject to all of the negative stereotypes that come with Habiru, among which was criminality. This is because Habiru were not only foreigners, but also natives who became outlaws by defaulting on debts or fugitives for other crimes. We read from the New Catholic Encyclopedia that the ranks of the Habiru are increased by the presence of fugitives. Some scholars, in fact, believe that this is the common characteristic of all Habiru. The Hittite king promises to extradite all subjects of Ugarit who flee to the territory of the Habiru. King Adrimi of Alalach escapes from his native land and finds refuge with the Habiru in Canaan. A Habiru mentioned at Mari is a fugitive from Eshnuna in the south, and an old Assyrian document perhaps attests a similar flight because of unpaid debts. The Habiru can constitute a grave threat to the peace. The Mari letters speak of them as endangering a city and engaging in razzias in which men and sheep are carried off. In the Amarna letters, to be a Habiru is synonymous with being a rebel against the Egyptian power in Palestine and Syria. It is the Habiru who are most frequently mentioned as supporters of the leaders of revolt, to whom they occasionally bind themselves by a solemn pact. The Habiru appear rather as bands of freebooters who, when political authority is strong, are organized as a kind of foreign legion, but who in times of political upheaval or weakness prey on villages or cities and support subversive elements in society. Thus, when Potiphar's wife called Joseph a Hebrew, it would actually make more sense if she meant it as a cognate for Habiru, because to read Hebrew in this case as being an ethnic group synonymous with Jew or Israelite would create an anachronism. This is because within the context of the story, the Israelites were still literally confined as being Jacob and his family, which was only one family among many in Canaan, making them hardly a distinct people group or nation at this time. The scholar S.A. West agrees, saying, in fact, when Potiphar's wife spoke of Joseph as the Hebrew servant, and Pharaoh's butler referred to him as a Hebrew, the designation was probably social rather than racial. As if to emphasize this, Joseph even described himself as having been kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. An interesting remark, because the land of Israel as a nation was not yet in existence. However, earlier just above concerning Habiru criminality, we do in fact see Canaan being associated with Habiru activity in historical records, which strongly agrees with a historical link between Hebrew and Habiru, thus explaining how Canaan could be called the land of the Hebrews without anachronism. So the nuance of this understanding is that Potiphar's wife may have been playing into tropes of Hebrew criminality as a means of strengthening her painting of him as a rapist. She was not just calling him a foreigner, but the worst kind of foreigner. The kind of foreigner who was associated with gangs and criminal activity in anticipation of modern rhetoric against undocumented immigrants today. In other words, just as people today want, when stuff goes wrong in society, they want to blame it on the undocumented immigrants or immigrants in general, that same kind of weaponizing rhetoric was used against Joseph. When something went wrong, they accused Joseph of being the Habiru, of being the dangerous foreigner who apparently tried to assault Potiphar's wife, which was a lie. And so we see this rhetoric, this anti-immigrant rhetoric being used against Joseph in this story. Accordingly, Joseph was imprisoned as one who was persecuted unjustly, and like many immigrants today, he leaned on his transformative faith to prevent him from falling into total despair. Again, in the words of Jung Lee's own experience of foreign and racist discrimination, the dandelion was greatly hurt but did not lose faith. It rooted itself deeper and deeper. The more it suffered, the more its roots penetrated into the ground. Its faith was expressed in its roots. The dandelion's faith became stronger and stronger as it faced the hardship of its existence. The faith that God had called it to dwell in this land gave it an indomitable courage to pursue its goal. Nothing could thwart its purpose. In prison, we read that Joseph worked for the betterment of his fellow prisoners and that God blessed him in this endeavor. In fact, it was through this increasingly humbling and marginalizing experience that Joseph would eventually be lifted to great heights through and despite of these great lows. This is because in prison, Joseph would meet servants who were close with Pharaoh, which eventually led to his release after it is revealed that he had the power to accurately interpret dreams. From great lows in slavery and prison, Joseph would rise to great highs by living an Egyptian dream as Pharaoh's vizier, which again put him in a place to make Egypt more welcoming for his Habiru brethren. When his brothers came to him looking for food as climate refugees because of a famine, which you can read about in Genesis 42, Joseph was a fully assimilated Egyptian and played the part. He was given an Egyptian name and had an Egyptian wife. His brothers did not recognize him, which may suggest his full adoption of Egyptian fashion and appearance. He also insisted upon speaking to them in Egyptian, despite retaining fluency in Canaanite. As is the case today, sometimes it is tempting to use one's assimilated position in society to distance oneself from immigrants who come after us. Joseph himself was tempted to use his newfound power and privilege to lord it over his brothers in a kind of vengeance, perhaps feeling vindicated that the dreams he had before as a youth were now finally coming to pass. However, Joseph began to remember his liminality. During his second meeting with his brothers, we read that they served him by himself and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. Here we read that Egyptians refused to eat with Habiru, and that Joseph chose to eat alone, neither with the Egyptians nor with his Habiru brothers. There are two possibilities here concerning why Joseph ate alone in this scene. One is that despite his assimilation, the Egyptians still saw him as a Habiru. However, the verse sort of implies that the Egyptians did normally eat with him, since it says the Egyptians who ate with him, which may mean that this time Joseph chose to leave the Egyptians. The Egyptians did not leave him. Thus, on the cusp of earthly power, Joseph remembers the lesson of humility by rejecting the pride of centralist power to again become liminal, between two worlds, as the reconciler of the weak with the strong, sitting between his native-born Egyptian friends and his foreign-born kin as a kind of mediator. Though he experienced rejection by both worlds, he still sought to love, embrace, and reconcile both of these worlds in a restored relationship of communitas. Indeed, it was during this banquet that we see Joseph weep the most as he shows the inner conflict of being torn between these two poles, between rejecting his past and reconciling with his past. In the end, Joseph is able to forgive, saying to his brothers that even though you intended to do me harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear, I myself will provide for you and your little ones. Joseph realized that his call to liminality was meant to call him away from his earlier pride to discover the humility that comes through vulnerability, so as to discover a renewed appreciation for what it means to care for the vulnerable. Joseph's journey is a journey of discovering that God's chosen are not called to privilege but to service, so that they may be vehicles and instruments of grace in preserving numerous peoples and caring for one's fellows and little ones. In becoming liminal, he sat between power as an Egyptian vizier and weakness as a Habiru in origin, so that he may reconcile both by using his power to care for the powerless, thus bringing right relationship between the two. However, this peace was contingent on Joseph's mediation. Although Pharaoh welcomed Joseph's family into the land, this did not mean that most Egyptians accepted them, as Genesis 46:33 to 34 implied, that most Egyptians still looked down on them as foreign shepherds, as Habiru. This actually shows a hidden economic motive in Pharaoh's generosity in that, being shepherds, the Israelites were open to doing the jobs that native-born Egyptians hated doing, which in this case was keeping livestock. You can read about that in Genesis 47, verse 6. Thus, like immigrants today, their welcome was precarious, dependent on the goodwill of powerful politicians and economic pragmatism. If any of these factors change, then the host will turn on them, since the regular people still see them with lackluster eyes. So in the next section then, we will talk about the beginning of the context of the Exodus and the story of Israel in Egypt and what led up to their persecution under the Egyptians and their enslavement. So that's what we'll see in the next section of this series.